Now that we're able to render a couple of meetups there with help of our meetup list and meetup item components, it would of course be good if those meetups would not come from our dummy data source, but from an actual server. And they should actually end up on that server because we created them on the Add New Meetup page. After all, that's the goal of this demo application. That on this add page, we have a nice little form for entering data about a meetup. So entering this kind of data in the end. And then that data should be sent to some server, to some backend, where it's then also stored in a database, so that then it can be fetched and loaded in all meetups. By doing that, meetups that are added here could be shared with all visitors from all over the world, since data is stored in a database on some backend server, not just in our browser. And the data would also be there if we reload the page. If we just store data in memory, any data is lost if we reload the page because the JavaScript application restarts and the previous state is lost. And therefore, the first step is to add this form to this Add New Meetup page so that then in a second step we can gather the entered data and send it to a server. And for this, we'll work in this new meetup.js file, which is the file that should render this meetup form. So in here, I'll actually also add a section and a h1 title of Add New Meetup. But then below that, I want to output the meetup form, which I will actually create and store in a separate file to, again, keep this new meetup page lean. Now, a good folder would be the meetups folder in the components folder. And therefore, in here, we can add a new file, the new meetup form file, for example, new meetup form.js. Now, attached again, you find a styling file for this file, the new meetup form.module.css, which you can just download and add next to this JavaScript file, so that you have some styles which I prepared for you. And in the new meetup form.js file, we now create another function because we're going to create another component, the new meetup form function and component, which, just as before, is exported here to make it available outside of this file. In the new meetup page component, below this title, we can then already add that new meetup form. Make sure you also add the appropriate import. Now, once you did add it, back in the new meetup form.js file, we can start with outputting the JSX code for the form. Now, I want to actually wrap this form again in this card to give it this card look. And that's why I created that separate card component before, so that we can now reuse that component. So now, besides using the card component in the meetup item component, we can also use it in the new meetup form simply by using it here. And of course, by importing it. You always need to import what you use in a file from the UI folder and the card file. Now, card will then be wrapped around the actual HTML form that we'll create, and then we'll, populate that form with various inputs. Now, I did provide that CSS file for the form, so let's also already import classes from /new meetup form.module.css to have these scoped styles. And we can start assigning classes on that form element where you should assign the form class like this. Now, inside of this form, you can of course structure this however you want, but to fit the styles which I provided to you, I'll add a div with a class of classes control. And in that div, I want to have a label where we say meetup title, for example, for the first input we're going to add. Now that input is added here and it's of type text. It should be required so that we have that in-browser validation. And I will give it an ID of title and then self-close it. And now connect this label to this input by adding the for attribute, but just as class, for is a keyword in JavaScript, and therefore the actual property name for setting this for value or for setting this attribute here is HTML4. So I add HTML4 as a prop, and that's another exception besides class name, where you use an attribute name that deviates from the regular HTML attribute name. It's basically the only other important exception besides class name, which you have to memorize. And then we point at title here. And this simply connects this label to this title for screen readers and other assistive technologies. Now we have this input with this label here, and we can now repeat this entire control div multiple times to also render a label for the meetup image, and maybe use an ID of image here and change this to type URL, since the image set here should actually be a URL pointing at an image. If you're interested in uploading files with React, that is not really that much of a React task, but mostly a backend server task, and hence I discuss file uploads in my Node.js course, for example. But to learn how to make file uploads work with React, I also have a resource attached, a tutorial, which you can take a closer look at to learn how to upload files with React. Here, we'll not upload files, we'll just insert the URL of an existing image, which already exists on some server. Then we can replicate this div again for our address here, let's say, and the ID could be address, and here we'll again just have some plain text as an input type. And thereafter, I want to have one more control, which is the actual description of the meetup. And hence, we could use description as an ID. But here, I'll actually not render an input, but instead a text area, which is another default HTML element. It'll still get that ID description here. And it will also still get the required attribute for adding this in-browser validation, and I'll set rows to 5. That's another default attribute which we can add to text areas. Now last but not least, below that I'll add another div with a class name of classes actions, and in there I want to have the button that submits the form. So here we can add a button where we say add meetup, and that button will then submit that form. That's how HTML in the browser works. If you have a button in a form, a button which is not of type button, so if you have a regular button like this, then such a button will submit that form. And we can later listen to that submit event. And this should be actions as a class here. And with that, if you save that file, you should see this form on the screen. Now the form doesn't work yet, but it's there.